One night in the middle of the 19th century, darkness had descended on the Ochil Hills, and a cold wind, accompanied at intervals with violent blasts of snow, blew in from the east. Around a blazing fire sat a group of happy faces. A story had been promised that evening, and everyone was expectant. The good wife plied the drinks diligently as a cat lay purring on the hearth. Then the head of the house, occupying the old armchair, began telling the story. He said, "You all know the Kirkstyle bodies, Kirkstyle being in Dollar in Clackmannanshire. Oh well, it's 80 years since John Drysdale, who was called Churchy, lived there, as honest a man as ever stopped in leather shoes. He was a very frugal man, but he had a good trait in his character, that of being kind to poor folk. When any came to his door begging, he didn't send them away empty-handed, but would give them some cheese with a bit of bread, and sometimes 2 or 3 bawbees, if he saw them needful. Nobody lived with him. A big tom cat was all his family, and when any of his friends bothered him about his lonely way of living, he used to say, "Wives are expensive, servants wasteful," and as long as he could make his own bed and kindle his own fire, he would never bother himself with either of them. At the back of his cottage lay the yard, where he grew green kale, cabbages and leeks that couldn't be surpassed by any in the whole county. He had 3 beehives, which stood below a box tree to shelter them from the rain and snow, but he didn't care for honey, so sold it all. It was rumoured by the local folk that he was fairly wealthy. This may have been true, for he was always buying and selling, and managed to keep 2 or 3 score of sheep as well. Wool brought a good price at the time, and with Alloa being the nearest market town for that commodity, John went there frequently. But to the tale. Every market day morning, John got out of bed, kindled his fire, got the kettle to boil, and made his brose quickly, gulping it down. He also drank a glass of real mountain dew. Then, shouldering his bundle, he set out for Alloa. It was a lovely summer morning. The sun was just beginning to keek over the Salin hills. The birds whistled among the trees. The rabbits and hares frisked about in the clover fields, and the bonny wee flowers bent down their heads, all drookit with dew. As his burden was getting heavy, it was some time before he got to the market. At last he reached it, disposed of the wool, and was making his way home again, when an old acquaintance whom he'd not seen in a long time fell in with him, and of course the two stopped by in a nearby public house to have a share of a gill. The gill was soon drunk, and another called for, and this went on until the two found themselves a little tipsy. They left the pub and began daundering the streets. More acquaintances were met with, and the public house was always the place they adjourned to. The sun had long been to rest before John thought about making a move, and it wasn't until 11 o'clock had struck that he set out. 7 long miles and bad roads lay before him, but being a hardy soul, he pushed on until he reached Howbog, where he sat down to take a breath and count the money he had left. While doing this, he heard a voice like someone in distress. He'd heard the stories about the ghosts and witches that haunted the bog, But being a little worse for wear, and bravado kicking in, he demanded, "Who's there?" "A poor man," was the answer. "Are you a deil's body or a God's body?" asked John. "I'm a God's body," replied the voice. "Come away with me then," returned John, and immediately a tall gaunt figure in ragged clothing stood before him. John moved on, and the ghost was told to follow. They reached Gateside, a public house in those days, attached to the brewery of the same name on Back Road in Dollar, but the family were all sound asleep. John, however, used his stick on the door with such force that the whole house was woken up, wondering who it could be at such an early hour of the morning. The good wife got out of her bed and, standing at the back of the door, asked, "Who's there?" "It's John Drysdale of the Kirk Stile who brings you the ghost of Howbog. Open, woman." The bolts were tentatively drawn, and the door opened, but the woman, on seeing John's companion, swayed with perfect fright. Cold water was thrown on her face, and as soon as she came round, John and his companion were shown into the kitchen. The big gathering coal, a piece of coal smothered in embers, was chopped up, but no one in the family would come near. John couldn't convince them that the ghost was in fact real flesh and blood. At last the good wife's feelings of humanity overcame her fears, and she hastened to make something warm for the old man. But it was too late. Exhausted, the stranger had leaned back in the chair and died. John lived many years after this, and often related the story, a tear glistening in his aged eye. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.